Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we share heartfelt tales of love, resilience, and second chances. Today, we invite you to join us on an emotional journey through the lives of Emily, a struggling single mother, and Ethan, a reclusive billionaire scarred by life's trials. Together, they'll discover the power of connection, healing, and new beginnings. Stay tuned to uncover how an unlikely bond transforms their lives in ways they never imagined. Emily brushed the frost from her daughter's scarf as the early morning wind whipped around them. Sophie, only 6 years old, clutched her lunchbox with tiny, gloved hands, oblivious to the storm of worry swirling in her mother's mind. Emily forced a smile, her heart heavy with the weight of another challenging day ahead. As Sophie skipped toward the waiting school bus, Emily waved, her hand lingering in the air long after the bus disappeared from sight. Life hadn't always been this hard. There had been a time when Emily dreamed of a beautiful future, a home filled with laughter, a supportive partner by her side, and a sense of security. But those dreams had crumbled years ago. The moment Mark, Sophie's father, walked out, his promises of love and partnership had been as fleeting as a summer breeze. Emily had been left to navigate the storm alone, a young mother determined to give her child a better life, no matter how much of herself she had to sacrifice in the process. The morning rush at the diner had been her reality for years, serving coffee and breakfast platters to customers who barely noticed her. But today, a neatly folded piece of paper in her pocket gave her a faint glimmer of hope. A new job awaited her, not glamorous, not ideal, but better. The agency had mentioned it was a private caregiving position for a man recovering from injuries. The pay was good. And for Emily, that was reason enough to try. When the taxi pulled up to the gates of Ethan Hayes' estate, Emily felt her breath catch. The sprawling lawns, ivy-covered walls, and grand double doors seemed to belong to another world entirely. Her worn coat and scuffed boots felt painfully out of place. She hesitated, questioning whether she should even step inside. But before she could dwell on her insecurities, the imposing door swung open. Mrs. Thornton, the housekeeper, stood in the entryway, her sharp eyes assessing Emily in an instant. "Mr. Hayes doesn't like to be kept waiting," she said curtly, gesturing for Emily to follow her. Emily's footsteps echoed on the polished floors as she ascended the grand staircase. Her nerves tightened with each step. And when she finally entered Ethan Hayes' study, her breath faltered again. He sat in a high-backed chair, bathed in golden sunlight streaming through the windows. His figure was imposing, broad-shouldered and commanding, but there was a weariness in the way he leaned on his cane, as if the weight of the world had settled on him. "Are you the nurse?" His voice was low and tinged with skepticism. "I'm Emily," she replied, steadying her voice despite her racing heart. "The agency sent me." Ethan's piercing gaze lingered on her, as though searching for some unspoken truth. Emily held his stare, refusing to flinch under the weight of his scrutiny. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Let's get started." The first days of her new job were a delicate dance of silence and routine. Ethan spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and formal. He watched her work with a guarded intensity, as if expecting her to falter. Emily, determined to prove herself, focused solely on her tasks, carefully tending to his injuries without prying into the layers of his silence. Yet, as the hours turned into days, Emily began to sense something beneath Ethan's cold exterior. It wasn't just the scars on his face or the stiffness in his movements that hinted at his struggles, it was the invisible weight he carried. The kind of burden one could only see if they had carried their own. Ethan Hayes had once been a name synonymous with success. A billionaire, celebrated for his sharp mind and charm. He had been the subject of admiration and envy alike. But the accident 2 years ago had changed everything. It had left him physically scarred and emotionally withdrawn. Retreating from the public eye into the seclusion of his mansion. To the world, Ethan Hayes was a broken man. To Emily, he was simply her patient. Despite the tension, Emily approached her work with quiet empathy. She knew what it was like to feel abandoned, to bear the weight of loss, to question one's worth. Her own scars, though invisible, reminded her that pain didn't have to be the end of the story. One chilly afternoon, as Emily adjusted a bandage on Ethan's hand, the sound of Sophie's laughter floated in from the courtyard. Emily froze, her heart skipping a beat. That day, unable to find a sitter, she had brought Sophie with her and left her under Mrs. Thornton's watchful eye. Ethan's brow arched slightly at the sound. "Your daughter?" Emily nodded, her voice tinged with apprehension. "Yes. Her name's Sophie." To her surprise, Ethan didn't seem annoyed. Instead, his expression softened, if only slightly. "How old is she?" 6, Emily said, pausing in her work. "She's the reason I'm here. Everything I do is for her." For a brief moment, Ethan's guarded gaze faltered, replaced by something gentler, almost understanding. He didn't say anything, but in the silence that followed, Emily felt the smallest crack in the wall he had built around himself. Though the awkwardness between them lingered, Emily began to notice subtle changes in Ethan's demeanor. His sharp words softened, and the rigid tension in his shoulders seemed to ease ever so slightly when she entered the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her hope that beneath the scars and bitterness, there was still a man capable of connection. What neither of them realized yet was that this fragile beginning, born of pain and resilience, would soon blossom into something neither of them had expected, a bond that would change both their lives forever. Emily settled into the routine of her new job, though the grandeur of Ethan Hayes' mansion never ceased to amaze her. Each morning, she dropped Sophie off at school before making her way to the estate. The cold, imposing walls of the mansion seemed worlds apart from the small apartment Emily and Sophie called home. Yet, within those walls, something unexpected was beginning to take shape. At first, Ethan remained distant, treating Emily's presence as an obligation rather than a necessity. His instructions were brief, his tone clipped, and he rarely looked at her directly. But Emily, with her quiet determination, was undeterred. She knew better than to take his guarded demeanor personally. Pain, she had learned, had a way of building walls around people, and Ethan's were as high as any she had ever seen. Days passed, and Emily began to notice small shifts in Ethan's behavior. His shoulders no longer seemed as rigid when she entered the room, and his curt responses began to carry hints of dry humor. On one occasion, as she cleaned the scar on his cheek, she caught him smirking at one of her offhand remarks about Sophie's love for pancakes. "You talk about her a lot," Ethan said, his voice softer than usual. Emily paused, gauging his tone. "She's my world," she admitted, carefully placing a fresh dressing over his wound. "She's the reason I get up every morning, even when I feel like I can't." Ethan studied her for a moment, his gaze sharp but no longer cold. "That kind of love, it's rare." Emily offered a small smile but didn't respond. She wasn't sure what surprised her more, the softness in his words or the fact that he had spoken them at all. One crisp autumn afternoon, Emily brought Sophie to the mansion again. The child had been bursting with excitement, thrilled at the chance to explore the sprawling estate. Emily had been hesitant, unsure of how Ethan would react. But Mrs. Thornton had reassured her that Sophie would be fine in the courtyard. As Emily adjusted Ethan's bandage, the sound of Sophie's laughter echoed through the open window. Ethan's gaze shifted toward the sound, his expression unreadable. "She seems happy," he said, almost to himself. "She is," Emily replied, her voice tinged with pride. "I try to keep it that way, no matter what." To her surprise, Ethan didn't turn away from the conversation. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. "It must be exhausting," he remarked, "keeping the world off her shoulders when it's already on yours." Emily's hand froze mid-motion. His words, though spoken casually, hit a nerve. She looked at him, unsure whether to be flattered or unnerved by his perceptiveness. "It's what parents do," she said quietly. "We carry the weight so they don't have to." For a moment, the room fell silent, save for the faint sound of Sophie's voice outside. Ethan seemed lost in thought, his gaze distant. When he spoke again, his tone was softer, almost vulnerable. "I wouldn't know," he admitted. "I've never had anyone to carry the weight for." Emily felt a pang of empathy for him. She wanted to say something comforting, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she focused on her task, sensing that Ethan had already said more than he intended. Over time, the bond between them began to shift. It was subtle, like the changing of seasons, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniable as the days went on. Ethan, who had once been a fortress of silence and bitterness, began to lower his defenses. He started asking Emily questions about her life, about Sophie, and even about the challenges of single motherhood. One chilly evening, as Emily prepared to leave for the day, she found Ethan staring out the library window. The golden light from the setting sun bathed his figure, casting long shadows across the room. He looked every bit the powerful billionaire he was. Yet there was a vulnerability in his posture that made Emily pause. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, breaking the silence. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging her presence but saying nothing. Emily hesitated before stepping closer. "Your injuries don't define you," she said gently, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Ethan flinched at her words, his jaw tightening. "Easy for you to say," he muttered bitterly. "You don't know what it's like to be reduced to this." Emily didn't flinch under his sharp tone. Instead, she met his gaze, her own steady and unyielding. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to be in your position. But I do know what it feels like to lose everything you thought you had and wonder if you'll ever find your way back." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Ethan's gaze softened, and for the first time, he didn't retreat behind the mask he so often wore. "And did you?" he asked quietly. Emily smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and hope in her expression. "I'm still finding it," she admitted. "But I've learned that the only way forward is to let people in." Ethan seemed to consider her words, his silence speaking volumes. In that moment, Emily saw something in him she hadn't seen before, a flicker of humanity, of longing, of the man he might have been before life had left its mark on him. As she left the mansion that evening, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The distance that had once defined their interactions was beginning to close, replaced by a fragile connection that neither of them fully understood. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her hope. And in the quiet of the mansion, as Ethan watched her walk away, he couldn't help but feel the same. The days at Ethan Hayes' mansion settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Emily would arrive each morning, her presence filling the quiet halls of the estate with warmth and purpose. She brought with her stories of Sophie's adventures, anecdotes about their modest life, and a steadfast determination to help Ethan heal, not just physically, but emotionally. Ethan, though still reserved, had begun to let his guard down. His sharp edges softened with every conversation, every shared moment of quiet understanding. But life, as Emily well knew, had a way of stirring the waters just when things seemed calm. One afternoon, as Emily was tending to Ethan's hand, she noticed a letter sticking out of her bag. She had received it earlier that day, but in the busyness of her routine, she had barely glanced at it. Now, the sight of the envelope filled her with unease. "Is something wrong?" Ethan asked, his tone uncharacteristically concerned. Emily hesitated before responding, her fingers tightening slightly on the bandage she was wrapping. "It's a letter from Sophie's father," she said quietly. "He wants to meet her." Ethan's jaw tightened, his expression darkening. "The man who walked out on you?" She nodded, her heart heavy. "He says he wants to make things right. But I don't know if I can trust him. And I don't know if Sophie should have to go through that." Ethan's gaze softened as he watched her wrestle with her emotions. "What are you going to do?" he asked gently. "I don't know," Emily admitted. "Part of me thinks I should let him try, for Sophie's sake. But another part of me is terrified that he'll hurt her the way he hurt me." Ethan reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The gesture, simple but sincere, sent a wave of warmth through Emily. "Whatever you decide," he said, his voice steady, "you don't have to face it alone." The words lingered with Emily as she returned home that evening. After hours of reflection, she decided to arrange a meeting. Sophie deserved the chance to know her father, even if it meant reopening old wounds. The meeting took place at a small cafe in the city. Emily's heart raced as she led Sophie inside, her hand tightly gripping her daughter's. At a corner table sat Mark Wilson, looking older and wearier than she remembered. He stood as they approached, a hesitant smile on his face. "You must be Sophie," he said, crouching to her level. Sophie glanced at her mother before responding, her voice soft. "Hi." The conversation began awkwardly, with Sophie asking questions about Mark's favorite color, his hobbies, and whether he liked ice cream. Slowly, her natural curiosity broke through the tension. But for Emily, every moment was a delicate balancing act between hope and fear. "I made a mistake," Mark said quietly, addressing Emily after Sophie had wandered off to look at a display near the counter. "A big one. But I want to fix it now. If you'll let me." Emily's chest tightened at his words. She saw the regret in his eyes, but it wasn't enough to erase the years of pain he had caused. Still, she knew this wasn't about her, it was about Sophie. When they left the cafe, Sophie seemed lighter, her laughter ringing out as she skipped ahead. Emily, on the other hand, felt the weight of the encounter settle heavily on her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held for Mark's relationship with Sophie, but she knew she had done the right thing by giving him a chance. As they walked back to the car, Ethan was waiting by the driver's door. He had insisted on accompanying them, though he'd stayed out of sight to give them privacy. When Sophie ran ahead to show him a small trinket she'd gotten, Emily found herself walking beside Ethan, her heart in turmoil. "You handled that well," Ethan said softly. "Did I?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I feel like I'm just making it up as I go." Ethan stopped and turned to face her. His expression was soft, his eyes filled with understanding. "You're doing more than making it up. You're giving Sophie a chance to know her father, even when it's hard for you. That takes strength." The sincerity in his voice caught Emily off guard. She had spent so long building walls to protect herself. But in that moment, she felt them begin to crumble. Ethan wasn't just offering words of encouragement, he was offering her a kind of support she hadn't realized she needed. Later that evening, as Emily tucked Sophie into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, thoughtful eyes. "Mommy?" Sophie asked, her voice filled with innocence. "Do you think Daddy will stay this time?" Emily's heart twisted at the question. She forced a smile, brushing Sophie's hair from her face. "I hope so, sweetheart. But no matter what happens, you'll always have me. And Mr. Ethan." The words slipped out before Emily could stop them. But as she said them, she realized they were true. Ethan had become a part of their lives, someone they could rely on. In the weeks that followed, Emily came to understand that life wasn't about having all the answers. It was about facing the messiness of reality, embracing the flaws, and finding strength in the connections we build with others. For Ethan, the journey was similar. The scars he carried, both visible and invisible, no longer felt like barriers. Emily and Sophie had shown him that healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about opening oneself to the possibility of love and connection. By letting each other in, Emily and Ethan discovered something they hadn't thought possible, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to create a new beginning. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Thank you for watching today's story on Empathy Stories. We hope Emily and Ethan's journey touched your heart and reminded you of the profound strength found in love, empathy, and resilience. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Share your thoughts below, we'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. Until next time, take care. And remember, the smallest acts of kindness can create the greatest transformations. See you in the next story.